All right, so let's get started. For the second diagram, it's essentially known as the song diagram. So as I was mentioning before, we're going to try to derive and dissect the rhythm out of our pieces, as well as add some information, again, that subjective quality. And some of you guys may or may have not found words last week, but now is where we'll implicate them, right? So in a simple sense, a diagram should be a simplification of a larger or more complex thing, right? So for instance, some of you guys have probably seen a diagram before when you make Legos, right? In fact, you'll notice that it doesn't have a step one, step two, do this, and there's not verbiage, there's not a dialogue. In fact, it shows pictures in step by step in order to communicate something bigger, like putting together an entire puzzle, right? However, in our case, we're just deriving rhythm and subjectivity, right? How does the song feel? So don't get me wrong, there's not a right or wrong answer there, but just saying bright or hard, there's some definitely better thesaurus-like words that we can use in order to, again, convey more information. But in our sense, we can start with a new file in Photoshop. Pretty simple. We're going to start off with the piece of paper that we want. I'm suggesting 11 by 17. However, if you want to make it consistent with your other diagrams, you could definitely use 12 by 18. And arguably, you could probably even use a 12 by 12 as well, right? So to be fair, there's a couple of options in there. In fact, I would even suggest if you're already using a 12 by 18, it would make sense to continue this 12 by 18. I'm just going to throw that hint out there because remember, like I was saying, eventually we're going to layer all these together. And one of those layers will be a little bigger and one of them will be a little smaller. So again, you might want to aim for consistency there. But in that sense, I'm going to start with a 350 resolution and a 12 by 18. Now it's in the wrong way, and I guess I could just make a new one, but also if I just wanted to fix that, I could just go to Image, Canvas Size, and flip it around, right? In my case, switch this to 18 and flip that back to 12. Proceed. And as you can see, it kind of gave us the background in there, right? Because our background color is set to black, obviously we could fix that, switch it to white. Not really a big deal. Honestly, another thing that you can do is the image size itself. So if you go to image size, same thing. You could switch these two if you didn't want the background issue, right? So if you press OK, it'll actually change the image. But again, just to kind of show you what we're about to do, really, relatively speaking, all we need now is the music, right? We need to understand this rhythm. And don't get me wrong, if you have trouble deciphering music, I'm not expecting anybody to suddenly know how to read music, and that's definitely not the case here. Honestly, we just want to understand it for what it's doing. And in my case, how many of you guys know how to read music? Is there anybody has read music before? So one thing that you could start to understand is that the more bars that you have on these notes, the faster that the note is played. For instance, some of you guys might see a key signature is what this is called, or a clef sign. This is what's known as a treble clef, and it's in a 2 flats. Honestly, it depends on the instrument what key this is exactly in. However, it's in a 2/4 beats per minute, so it's 2 beats per 4 measures, right? So essentially, you have an 8th note, you have a 16th note, and you have a quarter note. Again, very architectural if you ask me, right? It's actually a lot of math involved. In our case, a 16th note, is that long or short? Which one is a longer sound? A quarter note or a 16th note? A quarter. Why? Because it's a quarter of something. It's a little bit longer. It has a little bit more, right? More time being involved. Whereas if you start to see multiple bar lines, that indicates that it's a 16th or an 8th note, indicating that it's either fast or slow, right? So for instance, it'd be da 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 da, right? You kind of hear where it goes a little bit faster, right? But in that sense, another thing that we can start to do is simply derive a grid pattern. Now, don't get me wrong, you see that it's on a bar staff, which is what this is called, and it has 5 lines. If you remember back to elementary school, they had funny little rhymes called like Elvis's guitar broke down Friday, and that's how we'd kind of memorize some of the notes and the patterns. So don't get me wrong, you could take this to a certain higher level, especially if you start to understand and know music. You could even start to call out the notes, and to be fair, even start to play on the word aspect and even say, okay, well, this is an A note that's sustained. I'm going to put a word that starts with the letter A, right? Or obviously you can start to play with some of that information in that sense. However, let's say, at least in Maya's case, let's say that this was the main melody. For instance, and actually maybe I pick one that we all know very well. Oh, there's one we all know very well. Can you guys guess it? Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Right? You can almost see the melody involved, right? Especially if you've ever read music before, you can see that the triplet note is involved. Da 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 da. Rest. Da 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 da. And of course you see this little Osiris symbol, but of course it's called, I mean, I hate to say this, it's called a retard. And it basically means slow down and stop here, right? And hold it out for as long as the conductor thinks so. Then a rest. And then, of course, piano meaning soft, right? And there's a lot of different things that we can pick up on here. So I feel like I'm a little obligated to at least explain some of the parts and pieces. Again, not saying that you got to play this tomorrow or sight read in any sense of the word. But again, it's definitely not arbitrary that architects are asked to kind of go outside of their field and understand something else. I mean, don't get me wrong, how do we design a hospital if we're not a doctor? Well, we got to talk to a lot of doctors, nurses, patients, and we got to start to understand what they go through in order to design that building. So I'm giving you a small task of, what does a musician think? Right? What is a musician going to think about what you're doing here? Are you giving it an accurate representation, or are you kind of just maybe not so accurately displaying that information? So, but this is one that's pretty familiar, so all we need for this diagram today, and to be fair, you might have a bass clef and a treble clef. We only need one. To be fair, in this case, it's kind of the same going on in both. But I'm going to go ahead and take a screenshot. So in my case, this is all I really need. I could take this information, not a big deal. I'm going to take that screenshot. And you know what, I'm going to show you how to erase something too. So just in case you don't want those pieces. So we'll take that screenshot. And to be fair, on a Mac, you can quite literally just drag it right in. Maybe not. That's okay. If you can't drag it in, or if you're on a Windows machine, you can always go to File and place something. Right? You'll see that it actually has two options. You can place embedded and you can place linked. That's super important because, well, if I delete that screenshot and I place it linked, it'll go away, right? So definitely important there. When I'm placing something, I normally embed it into this project. That way I don't lose it or accidentally get rid of it. So let's go ahead and embed that. I'll go over to my downloads, screenshots, take that screenshot in there. We'll let it do its thing, let it load a little bit. Well, that is not the screenshot I wanted. Get out of here. Let's try that again. Sweet. And we'll go to File, Place, Place Embedded. And of course put that screenshot. There we go. But relatively speaking, this is really the only component we need for this diagram. And honestly, after we do it, you'll be like, okay, that's all we have to do? Yeah. I mean, it's not an overly complex system. However, let's say I wanted to further manipulate this or refine it, right? In some cases, maybe I don't need Allegro con brio in there because that doesn't pertain to what I'm trying to diagram. But maybe what I'm actually trying to get at is this motif, this rhythm, right? This grid that is just so inherently seen. But in our case, I might have some tidbits of information that I don't actually need. So in my case, I could use E as an eraser and erase them. However, you'll notice by default, especially when you import something, that it's like, hey, I can't do anything to this because it's not rastered yet, and that's okay. We'll press OK. We'll take this layer itself and right-click, and there's actually a couple of options that we can do to it. In fact, we could flatten the whole image and make it work for us, although I don't recommend that because if you have multiple layers, it's going to flatten all those layers together. In our case, what we could do is actually, we could do some blending options in order to get rid of some of these things, but we need to convert it to a smart object. So convert to smart object. Sweet. However, once we do that, it says, okay, are you sure? And yeah, we can of course erase things. Now that's really just erasing it, right? It's just changing it to the color white. You may actually notice that even our screenshot wasn't exactly white. And to be fair, we might be able to get rid of other things that we don't necessarily need, right? Little symbols that we don't understand, and maybe we don't want to get them necessarily involved if we don't understand them. Maybe I don't need this entire bottom bar at all, right? So I can use my lasso tool and really pick this apart, right? For instance, I can get everything at once that I don't need. I can hold shift and continue a straight line even. Go around things. But maybe I want to delete some of that stuff. Maybe I don't need that bottom piece after all. Sweet. Now I could just hit delete, but I mean, yeah, I guess that works as long as you have a white background there. You'll notice that if you do this and say there's any other color there, well, usually it turns into that color, but I missed out. I guess you can just delete these days. To be fair, there's usually an update on these things, so hey, if you can delete it, you can delete it. Go for it. But in my case, I still have a tidbit there, so I'll hit E for erase and just get rid of it. Of course, I can take this layer and I can do Command T as in transform and really start to align this up. Another aspect that I eventually want to do is actually derive the grid from this. So nicely enough, I can really just drag these lines out. Now these aren't the actual lines that are there, and you'll see that I'm centering them actually to the note itself. And we can zoom in a little bit. But we're maybe trying to define that rhythm. In our case, maybe it's the spaces in between the rhythms that we actually want. Now these are really just guidelines. They don't actually print, they don't actually show up on the page. You'll notice if you zoom in or zoom out, they also change size. They're not actually physical. But you can move them around, and it does start to reveal a certain relationship, right? Something that we could potentially use for our project and overlay method. However, also keep in mind that when you click on a layer, the only way to interact with it is to, of course, click on that layer itself. And it looks like I still need to get rid of some things. I still could. Because at the end of the day, I want to make sure that the person that I'm talking to understands what I'm doing. So if I have to remove something that's possibly confusing, we got to. Of course, I can hold spacebar and actually pan. So that is, of course, how I'm doing that. And it looks like I got rid of too much, and not a big deal for honestly what we're doing today. But let's finish up the diagram. Get more of the triplets. Then lastly, let's draw some lines and add some text. So as I was saying before, these are just guidelines. So don't get me wrong, if we print this out, there's not going to be those lines there. So we need to brush them in ourselves. And what's nice about that is we can control the color, the line weight, and really everything in between. So in my case, I'm going to go for a kind of graphite color because that's just what I do. You can also right click and change the hardness. You can change, if you have multiple brush types, of course you can have at it. And by default, there's quite plenty actually. But in my case, at least for today, I'm just going to do a regular, soft line. And I may even want to apply some line weight to it. So for instance, maybe large line weights. Maybe I want to use that as my indication. And maybe I want to use smaller line weights. In fact, since I notice there's something repeating, I'm going to do it on its own layer. Call it lines. I'm going to lock this one, just that way I don't accidentally move it. And actually brush these on this layer. I'm going to go all the way across the page. Familiar, right? Just like the golden ratio. And maybe get some smaller line weights involved. you'll notice that you can kind of lock on to these lines and just use them as guidelines. The reason I say that is because your first time drawing in Photoshop can be somewhat difficult. Another aspect is, well, if you notice some repeating element, right, you could copy and paste it, because who wants to do that all over again? And you could also keep brushing it in, nothing wrong with that either. However, keep in mind you do have to be on a layer. Now let's paste that one again. So you'll notice I'm going back to my move tool, and when I paste it in as a new layer. So keep that in mind. I could also use my arrows to dial things in and almost move it like a separate component in itself. One thing to note, guys, you don't have to do this in Photoshop if you don't want to. As you can see, I could clearly just print out a staff and draw on it as well, right? And of course use my architectural freehand lettering or architectural drafting lettering and really do the next part as well. But as you can see, there's a certain niceness to being able to accurately depict things, and it's not a bad first tutorial for Photoshop. But as you can see, I have some repeating elements, but not always in the same way. At the same time, I could declare that the rest is also part of the rhythm, the silence. In fact, in music class, they'll often tell you the silence is just as important as the sound. Go figure. I mean, the light is just important as the darkness, otherwise I wouldn't be able to notice it in architecture in the first place. So again, we have another dualistic aspect, right? Silence and sound being another one. And this could also even start to be interpreted as silence and sound, or the length of them. Don't get me wrong, I know that usually at the end of the day, these more or less look like barcodes, but instinctively there's actually some secret rhythms behind them. In my case, another aspect is, well, maybe I realized I kind of did the diagram wrong, or maybe it's the wrong size. Another aspect to using Photoshop that is nice is I can simply unlock everything. I can hold shift and take everything. I can do Command T for transform, and I can really scale the entire drawing. So again, you'll notice that my grids didn't do anything there, right? But again, I can rescale the whole drawing if I must, right? Or just decide that maybe I want to get some more information, or even manipulate it in some way. In my case, maybe I want to get rid of that treble clef and time signature, and I just want to get, say, the information. So I'm going to scoot that up a little bit. And that would definitely be fine too, right? Last but not least, let's get some words involved. And to be fair, I probably should complete the diagram. However, for the sake of tutorial and speed and time, well, let's just move on to the next part. The next part's pretty simple. In my case, let's say I was done with this. I could take the entire piece and I could group it, right? Turn it into a group and call it diagram. That way, if I want to turn off the words or diagram at any moment, I could, right? Another aspect is, well, I could delete the grid lines if they're no longer useful or anything like that. Again, you kind of just take each one and delete them. This one's kind of painstakingly because, well, let's face it, I can't just highlight them all like I would in Rhino or AutoCAD. Literally have to click on them and delete them. You can also use show grids and hide grids, but I find that gets really confusing, especially if you accidentally forget and make multiple grids. Then you have like a bigger issue on your problem. But let's say that was my diagram, and I definitely want to emphasize maybe some of the feelings that are involved in this particular piece. For instance, there's something maybe colossal, if you will, about that silence. For instance, in the song it goes dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. In a way, I at least feel, in my opinion, that the silence is often more important in that song than actually the notes themselves. That it's the rhythm and the motif all together, of course the silence of which makes that piece so beautiful. So in my case, I'm going to use my text box. I'm going to make a new layer, and it's going to do that by default. As soon as I make a text box, it's going to make a new layer. I'm going to go with, I don't know, rest or colossal. In fact, I might even have to look up the word colossal. Does anybody know how to spell that? Colossal. Thank goodness for Spelled correct, right? I'd be nowhere without it. But another aspect that's really nice about the computer is I can mess with the fonts, and I can mess with the colors. I can still mess with the weight and the depth of what's going on in this piece. And what's nice is I don't have the ability to even mess up. I can make it bigger or smaller, or I don't know, by 128. Too big, too small, right? These kinds of things. In my case, go back to the word colossal. But what's nice is you'll notice it is transformable. However, maybe there's a better way to show it. And you know, it's kind of blending in too much with my background. So I'm going to take this piece. Usually you can click 3 times and of course change the color. I'm going to go with a slightly blue. So you could definitely add some color. And don't get me wrong, not every single space needs a word, but maybe you boil it down to 3 or 5 words, right? Really starting to put together, that way somebody can hear your music or understand your rhythm in a matter of seconds, rather than having to listen to the song even at all. It also ends up being a successful transformation between sound and now some sort of visual diagram of that sound, which in many cases, you may have guessed it, when we read music, that's essentially what is happening, a visual representation of something that is not visual, right? However, let's add another one, and to be fair, there's some more tips and tricks, so I'm going to lock these because I keep accidentally clicking on them. So again, that lock button, right? And I don't need that one. And what is really nice is you can easily copy something by holding Option and holding Shift, and by all means, right? We could even start to mess with how big they are as well. Don't get me wrong, it's really starting to impose. So, I mean, another aspect that I like to do is I can change the opacity of something. Yeah, try and do that on your drafting table. It is possible, right? But it, of course, takes a lot of planning, right? In our case, it's a matter of switching a button, right? And of course, controlling the piece itself. Now, I wouldn't get all fancy with the colors. I'm just using the accent color so that you can kind of pick it, right? And you definitely see that I'm expressing the word colossal, and that even there's a hierarchy. I can even implore some of the organizational principles even into this as well, such as hierarchy or, again, obviously rhythm being the main one. But I think I saw a hand up. Maybe it was just stretching. Fair enough. Otherwise, relatively speaking, we can do the exact same thing, honestly, in Illustrator. Sorry, this is a previous project from Computer Graphics. You can also eventually do floor plans and sections in these as well. Really, a lot of the same things going on there. So 11 by 17, or is 18 by 12. And relatively speaking, we can kind of do the same things. Command R or Control R can bring us a ruler. And we can essentially do the exact same things. You'll notice we draw lines a little bit differently, but I'll leave that up to you. And to be fair, either of these programs you could definitely use, right? One will give you a better quality, and that's Illustrator when it comes to text. However, overall, I think Photoshop gives us a much more artistic ability, right? We can really control the opacity better, the colors better, and the drawing sensibilities better. If you want a harder line versus a softer line, those are much easier to perform in Photoshop. However, this is the diagram we're looking for Friday in terms of the song diagram. Otherwise, any questions about that, guys?
Can we use any piece of the song?
Absolutely. Yeah. You could definitely draft it. Absolutely. So there's definitely some options there. You can go hybrid on it. You could scan what you did physically and still put digital words or those kinds of things. So it could definitely be a hybrid situation. Great questions. Any others, guys? The paper size, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you chose 12 by 12, I'd probably stick to a 12 by 12. And that's because of where this project is eventually going. Eventually we are going to layer them together And it is going to get a little weird if one's big and one's smaller. You're going to be like, which side do I put it on? Those kinds of things. So it might be, again, it's not the end of the world if you have different sizes, but it might read a little bit better if they're all the same. Correct. Absolutely. So don't worry, we're not putting them together yet. They are separate diagrams. I do want to see your 3 on Friday, abstract instrument, but then I also want to just see one music and music diagram, right? So a simplification of your music. Really great questions, guys. Thank you. Any others? We'll talk about those. I mean, one that you could possibly get recorded and view later in terms of questions. I'll help you figure that out. No other questions about Photoshop or Illustrator, guys? We'll leave it at there.